Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to a special weekend episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Carbox Brewing. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. We're doing this weekend mini episode because there have been reports published in the last 24 hours or so that the Kevin Durant trade negotiations, which the Rockets still appear to be in on, are entering their final stages, with a deal possible in the next few days. The Suns going through their offers from teams such as the Rockets, the Miami Heat, the Minnesota Timberwolves, perhaps the San Antonio Spurs and New York Knicks, although recent reporting suggests that they're a lot less likely at this point in time. So I'm going to catch you up on where I think the negotiations actually are, somewhat my reading of the tea leaves, somewhat sourced, just educated guesses for the most part on my part on where things stand on midday Saturday, the 14th, and where I think things are likely to go over the next couple of days as the negotiations enter their final stages. And then I'm going to go through the reasons to do the deal, the reasons not to do the deal, and why, assuming the cost is reasonable, I am generally in support of this. So let's start with the state of play, because I think it's becoming very clear. The Rockets are where Kevin Durant wants to be, at least among the three teams that are being talked about by ESPN's Shams Charania. That's the Rockets, the Heat, the Timberwolves. It's been reported that KD wants to be in Texas. Obviously, he played his college ball at UT, still has a lot of ties to the state. In Houston, he has direct ties to Ime Udoka, Royale Ivy, now DJ Augustine in the front office. There's lots of reasons that KD would want to be here, and that's before going into the strength of the team, which just finished off a 52-30 season, fourth best record in the NBA, second best in the Western Conference, and KD, still an all-star, even at 36 years old, could perhaps put the Rockets into that true contention tier as soon as next season. So there's reasons for KD to want the Rockets. There were also reports that he was interested in the Spurs as well, with San Antonio obviously even closer to Austin where he played his college ball. But the Spurs are quite as close from a timeline perspective as the Rockets are. And I think that's why it looks like they're dropping back in the bidding, because they have less of an incentive than the Rockets do to pay a price that would be acceptable for the Suns. So if the Spurs aren't willing to bid at an acceptable level and KD wants to be in Texas, then Houston is the spot, at least in terms of his wish list. And so I think that's why every report from Shams, ever since he started listing teams a few days ago, has had Houston as the first team out of his mouth. He's done several TV spots, a couple of stories online, and in every one of them, if you listen to the ordering of the teams, the Rockets are the first team that he mentions. That's not a coincidence. It's, in my opinion, because that's where KD and his representation want to be out of the realistic options. And I'm not going to go too deep into, the possibilities for the Rockets, because honestly, I don't think a lot has changed since June 3rd. There was this report from Kelly Iko of The Athletic, and I had a pod reacting to it the next day on June 4th. You can find it in our archives. And I'll read you the original report from Kelly 11 days ago on the 3rd of June. I really don't think much has changed from a Houston perspective here. This is not to say the Rockets and Suns are not in communication. Phoenix is aggressive in pursuit of trading Kevin Durant and regaining control of their draft capital, starting with the number 10 pick in June's draft. Since the end of the season, Houston has fielded several calls from Phoenix, who have since gradually lowered their asking price for Durant. There is a price in which the Rockets would be interested, but with fear of breaking up their roster for a 36-year-old coming off injury, doubt remains over a deal materializing. I said it at the time and I stand by it. The key phrase there is a price where the Rockets would be interested. That was always, when we talked about this hypothetical for months, going back to the trade deadline, when you have to match salaries for a guy that's going to be making over $50 million, is there a point in which there's actually a financially feasible path that would work for the Rockets? It seems there is. And with that in mind, they are a viable destination. And I talked about it on that pod. I'm not going to go through the financial math nearly as much today, but most likely it's either Jalen Green as the primary salary matching piece or Dylan Brooks, and then one of Jabari Smith Jr. or Reed Shepherd, one of your young prospects, making about $10 to $12 million a year, Dylan at 22. The bottom line, you need to get in the vicinity of $35 million from next year's payroll. Jalen will be at a little over 33, so he would do it alone. With Dylan, it would have to be in combination with someone else. But you have about $13 million in expiring salaries between Jock Landale and Aaron Holiday that would get you, again, to 13. And then you need to get to, the mid to upper 40s in order for a deal to work financially for Kevin Durant in the low to mid 50s. The question is how you do that last 35 million or so. Jalen could come very close to doing it by himself. If it's not Jalen, then Dylan and either Jabari or Reed. That's the most likely path. And Kelly reported on the 3rd that there is a price where the Rockets would be interested, i.e. one that's financially feasible. And so it just depends on whether the Suns see that as a deal that's worth doing for them. And now we're entering the closing stages, because if the Suns are going to get a pick in the 2025 first round as part of this deal, and I think if it's the Rockets, obviously the number 10 overall would be highly likely to be in the deal. They had a tough enough time last year finding minutes for Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore, so I don't think they want to bring in another prospect who'd be blocked from NBA playing time. Then it behooves the Suns to do a deal a week to 10 days before the draft, because that allows them to actually go through scouting processes and bring guys to their facility for interviews, and to actually maximize the value of that pick by allowing them to do homework on what makes the most sense. For months, it's been talked about that the draft is something of a deadline, because getting a 2025 pick and doing something of a reset in terms of the timeline for the Suns would make sense. Well, in a vague sense, yes, you'd probably want a 2025 draft pick, and you'd want to make the pick yourself as opposed to have it selected for you by somebody else. But really, it's not the first round of the draft on June 25th. Really, it's that window where we are now. We're 11 days out from the first round. That's the sweet spot, because then you have time to actually go through the draft process yourself and bring some of these guys to your facilities for workouts, interviews, whatever the case may be. So that's why in the last 48 to 72 hours, you've seen reports that these negotiations are entering the final stages. I don't think there's a ton of negotiating going on from a Rockets perspective. I think the offer that's out there and what they're willing to do is pretty much the same now as it was 10 or 11 days ago. It's more the Suns have this incentive to get to the finish line with these negotiations, and the Rockets are always there. Once it was confirmed there's a price that works, they're certainly in the equation. The Suns are also trying to see what other options are from other teams across the NBA, and then they'll compare those offers amongst themselves. They'll obviously work with KD and his agency representation to ideally find something that's satisfactory to them, because I think to get peak value, ideally the team that's trading for Durant would also be open to signing him to a contract extension, and conversely, Durant being willing to sign a contract extension because he wants to be there. Otherwise, would the team bid peak value for a guy who's entering the final year of his contract and conceivably could leave you for no compensation in a year? I don't know. So it behooves the Suns and Durant to work together on a destination that's palatable for both sides. And then we'll see at the end of this process what those offers are. And, the Suns will make the final choice themselves, but what those final offers are will depend, in my opinion, on this back and forth negotiation between the Suns, KD and his representation, the teams involved, and what KD is or isn't willing to do when it comes to a contract extension and any other factors within his control with that team. It's not that KD will make the final choice himself. That will be the Suns. However, Durant's involvement in this process, he and his agency representation, that will likely influence what the offers are from those other teams. For example, would the Heat be willing to throw in Khalil Ware, who had a very promising rookie season? That probably depends on whether Durant is willing to sign an extension in Miami, which I'm sort of skeptical that he would, because it doesn't look to me like the Miami Heat are a Kevin Durant away from title contention, even in a weak Eastern Conference. And so if Durant isn't willing to put his signature on a document this summer to turn that 1 year into 2 or 3, then I don't know if it makes sense for the Heat to bid all out with a promising young prospect such as Khalil Ware. And so that's where we are now. And negotiations are picking up simply from the standpoint of, and it's more negotiations, in my opinion, between the Suns and other teams, because the connections between Durant and the Rockets have been there for a long time. And now we know from Kelly Ecos reporting back on June 3rd that there's a price where the Rockets would do it. It's just a matter of whether that works for the Suns. Now the Suns are trying to see what other options there are in terms of what would work for KD. And, maybe one of these other teams is willing to do what the Toronto Raptors did in 2018, and they did win a title out of it, even though Toronto wasn't on the so-called list of desired destinations for Kawhi Leonard in San Antonio. Toronto did it, and they ended up winning a title. They called the bluff, and, well, I guess it wasn't a bluff because they did leave a year later, but they certainly don't regret it because they won the title in 2019. So maybe that plays into this as well. Maybe there's a wild card, and Shams has mentioned that possibility that's not even among the so-called top 5 or top 3 that swoops in and gets the deal done. But I think the Houston possibility, it's been there all along. And now what the Suns are doing are negotiating with these other teams, negotiating with KD and his team, and saying, hey, are there other teams beyond the Rockets and Spurs where KD would be willing to sign an extension? If not, what would those other teams be willing to bid in a scenario where they're only getting one guaranteed year of Kevin Durant? And then they'll make a decision once they get to a point in which there are consequences to waiting. And in the next few days, we're reaching that point because with the draft now 11 days away, there are consequences to getting too close to the draft and acquiring a pick such as the number 10 that the Rockets own actually from the Suns based on that Brooklyn draft deal they did this time a year ago. If you don't do the deal soon, you're not going to be able to maximize the value of that pick because you're not going to be able to do your pre-draft scouting processes and interviews and so on and so forth. The Suns have reshaped their front office, and that adds another layer of unpredictability to this. You've got a relatively new owner. You've got a new GM. So in terms of what are they willing to do in these negotiations, there's some volatility there. But also, if you're an owner and you invest heavily in bringing in a new GM, a new coach, or reshaping basketball operations, then yeah, you want to give these guys the opportunity to actually go through the pre-draft process and give them the best chance possible to pick the player that they think is going to work best for them long term. That's where I think we're at now. It's basically a standoff in which KD wants the Rockets. I think Minnesota in particular, I'm skeptical on Miami because I don't think they're a Kevin Durant away from title contention. But Minnesota, I do think if you add KD to Anthony Edwards, that gets intriguing. But Minnesota is probably reluctant to bid super heavily if Kevin isn't willing to extend there. And we haven't had any leaks that Kevin is interested in Minnesota. So I think Minnesota is wanting KD to want them, i.e. be willing to sign an extension, be happy there, buy in on that partnership with Anthony Edwards. And then Phoenix is either wanting Kevin Durant to expand his list, in other words, be open to a destination such as Minnesota or Miami that's not the Rockets, because if he does that, it probably opens up a pathway to Minnesota or to Phoenix getting more in a trade from a team such as Minnesota, or they simply want to leverage or try and leverage Houston into paying more. To me, that's the standoff. And I put this on my Blue Sky page this morning, Saturday the 14th. KD wants the Rockets. Minnesota wants KD to want them. Phoenix either wants KD to expand his list or for Houston to pay more in its bid. In my opinion, the Rockets' position is the same as it was 10, 11 days ago and probably the same for months before that. There's interest, but it's at a relatively low price point. I don't think anything has changed in the last couple of weeks other than we're getting to a point in which there's something of a deadline for the Suns. They want to get this deal done at the latest, it sounds like, by a week before the draft so that they can go through their own processes with whatever picks they get out of this deal. And so things are entering the final stages, not necessarily because the Rockets are heating up their negotiations or offering more. No, it's just the Suns got to figure this out one way or another. Obviously, Kevin's not going to be on the roster next year, and so now they're just trying to make the best choice they can and to move on. They've got their GM, they've got their coach, and the draft is getting close. They just want closure, and so that's where I think we're at entering this weekend. And as far as what's going to happen, the phrase I would use for my conversations around the Rockets is cautious optimism. They're hopeful. There's definitely interest, but it's not a given. We have seen some examples in these types of standoffs before where the player doesn't win. Now, the hope is that with Kevin being only 1 year out until his free agency, that gives him even more leverage than a star that has, say, 2 or 3 years left on his contract. But there have been some examples lately of the team winning out. And there's actually one that involves the Rockets. If you recall the 2017 offseason, after the Rockets acquired Chris Paul and paired him with James Harden in late June, the Rockets wanted Carmelo Anthony, but there was this standoff of, do the Rockets have assets that work for the Knicks? The Knicks didn't want to take the contract of Ryan Anderson as matching salary. And so this drug out for a few months. The only real deadline was training camp. And what ended up happening was Melo expanded his list to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who had matching salary that was more palatable for the Knicks. And that's what got the deal done. And then I mentioned Kawhi Leonard in 2018. The Toronto Raptors were not on his list when Kawhi was running out of San Antonio, but they just took the risk and said, hey, we think we can win a title. If we get this guy, we'll worry about everything else later. And then they did win a title. Usually in the player empowerment era, the player gets what he wants. And Kevin Durant's one of the top 15 players of all time, in my opinion. I think he has even more leverage than most. Behind the scenes, he's a powerful guy. But it's not a given. There have been star players that haven't gotten their way before, even with just 1 year left on their contracts. And Phoenix is very unpredictable, relatively new owner, brand new GM. There's not much of a track record here. I think the Rockets, they feel like KD wants to be here. And with that in mind, especially with the only other team that we know he'd be okay with, the Spurs, seemingly not being in the bidding, at least not aggressively in these late stages, there's hope that Kevin can leverage his way here, but it's not a given. There are recent examples, and I think some of this is going to depend on where the information comes from in terms of trying to read the tea leaves. All these Shams reports list the Rockets first. I think that's because he's talking to Kevin Durant's people at Boardroom. Rich Kleiman is this guy. I think Zach Lowe reported late Friday night, early Saturday morning that he was hearing, Zach Lowe on The Ringer podcast with Bill Simmons, said that he's hearing the most buzz about the Timberwolves with the Rockets at number 2. I'm guessing that's coming from the Suns because with Phoenix, they know Houston is there. Houston has always been there, and that's where Kevin wants to be. What they want is to create a bidding war. They want more teams to be viable, either for Kevin to go there because that team is willing to bid more than Houston. Maybe the Timberwolves are willing to use, I guess they sort of have to, Rudy Gobert, and perhaps the Suns want to stay relevant with Devin Booker, or maybe they can find a third team to reroute Rudy Gobert to and get some good assets that way. Recent Defensive Player of the Year. The bottom line from a Suns perspective, regardless of whether they actually want to send Durant to a team that's not Houston because they don't like the Houston offer, or maybe it's they want it to seem like they're going to send Kevin to a team that's not Houston because they want to scare Houston into giving up more assets. And maybe you buy into the theory that the Suns really want to deal with the Rockets because Houston has, their 25, 27, and 29 draft picks. Either way, it behooves the Suns to hype up destinations that aren't the Rockets, either because they don't like the Rockets' assets or because they want to try and leverage the Rockets into giving up more. Either way, I think the reports out of Phoenix are going to hype up teams that aren't Houston. I think reports that are sourced from the Durant side of the fence are going to hype up the Rockets. And there's also this report from the Suns beat writer, the Arizona Republic, Dwayne Rankin, I believe is his name, cited the league source as saying that the Rockets are the, quote, ideal destination for KD. I would bet anything that league source is Rich Kleiman or someone very close to him. I think that's where these negotiations are right now. Everybody's sort of playing a game of chicken, and we'll see what happens over the next 24 or 48, 72 hours. I really don't think it's going to go on much longer than that because the Suns do want to go through their pre-draft processes. I think it could happen. I don't think it's a given, and I think there's a lot of volatility here, especially with the Suns being so unproven at the top ranks of their organization. The GM, ownership, that adds another layer of unpredictability here that maybe it works well for the Rockets, maybe it doesn't. But anybody who's betting a lot of money at this stage, I think that would be misguided because this could go any number of directions. I think the Rockets are in the game and they're interested, but whether it actually happens, time will tell. And that time probably is not going to be all that long. Now, that's the state of play in terms of the negotiations and what I think is actually happening. To close out this pod, I want to address what I'm seeing more of on social media, which is the debate of should it happen? Because for all the strengths of Kevin Durant, he's still an all-star level player, one of the greatest of all time. He's going to turn 37 later this year, and the Rockets would be giving up at least one member of their young core, these 7 first-round picks from the last 4 NBA draft cycles, and 2 if you count the 2025 pick and you want to call this a core 8. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but I guess you could argue that. And with those guys all being, I think, 23 years old or younger, well, 24 in the case of Tari Eason, but I don't think he's in these discussions at all, then yeah, there's some sticker shock to trading assets from that stockpile for a 36-year-old Kevin Durant, especially when the baseline scenario is as high as it is, which you just finished up a season at 52-30, number 2 in the West. And so you could easily argue you just stay the course, let this young core continue to marinate and be patient. I get it. That's an absolutely fair argument to make. The reason that I'm generally in favor, if the price is right, of a Kevin Durant trade, you need to look at it from both the boom and the bust versions of what could happen. And I think that's even more true here with Kevin being at 36 years old. So the boom scenario, I think it's pretty clear. You were 52-30 as is. If you replace Dylan Brooks or Jalen Green in your starting lineup with Kevin Durant for a team that's already 52-30, number 2 in the West, I have no doubt that you beat the Warriors. You took to 7 games as is. I think you probably beat the Timberwolves in the second round as well. You probably don't beat the Thunder in the Western Conference Finals, but you're at least there. You're in the conversation. And in terms of projecting out to next year, I think you'd be that team right behind the Thunder. And if you get another leap from either Amen Thompson or Alperen Şengün, who I don't think would be in these talks no matter what, then that could put you over the top. The way the Rockets are looking at this, I said on the pod on June 4th, a Kevin Durant trade at the right price point, it opens your contending window earlier, but it doesn't shut it any sooner because you're not giving up assets that are significant enough to radically transform your timeline. So that's the boom scenario. You could legitimately get to championship contention as soon as next season. Now, the bust scenario, and yeah, at 36 years old, soon to be 37, you definitely have to keep this in mind. It's entirely possible that 2026 Kevin Durant becomes 2017, 2018 Carmelo Anthony, to use the analogy that I cited in the first segment. We were all hyped on Carmelo in the 2017 offseason, and then, as mentioned, he relented and expanded his list to include Oklahoma City at the last minute, and the Knicks traded him there. Well, what ended up happening is that he just wasn't that good, period. He got past his prime, and while he was still a bucket, quote unquote, he no longer had the juice to be particularly efficient. He couldn't defend at a high level. He just wasn't a winning player anymore. And then we all know what happened. His market was so low that he signed at the minimum with the Rockets the next offseason and then got basically told to stay away from the team after 10 days and eventually released or traded away. Same thing as a release. It can happen quickly with aging stars that are very ball dominant. It hasn't happened even a little bit for Kevin Durant yet. Let's be clear. He was still a 50-40-90 shooting guy last year, elite player, all-star. There are no signs to this point that Kevin Durant is about to go down the Carmelo Anthony road from 2017, 2018. But it's not impossible at his age. And so you have to acknowledge the bust scenario there. Now, the flip side, with sports science becoming so advanced these days, look, guys, especially the elite ones that prioritize taking care of their bodies, and I think compared to Melo, that's something that Kevin puts even more of a priority on. We are seeing primes extend. LeBron James is playing well into his 40s. Tom Brady played until he's 45. Now, I know being a quarterback, the athletic requirements are not the same as being a star in the NBA, but I just mentioned that example, and it's not apples to apples. So no, I'm not saying I expect Kevin Durant to play until 45. That's crazy. But could he have 2 or 3 really good years still left? Yeah, it's possible. And so that goes into the boom equation. Maybe he lifts you into title contention next year and you get to watch one of the best players in NBA history play for your franchise. There's value in that. And maybe it lasts a couple more years after that. And the extension proves worthwhile. And it's something of a bridge until someone like Amen Thompson or Reed Shepherd, whoever it may be, is able to take the reins as your primary offensive engine and playmaker a few years from now. That's the boom scenario, and it's in play, but the bust scenario, it's valid as well, and we have to consider it. Like, he's at an age in which not too many players historically have played at an elite level with this much age, this much mileage on them. So, yeah, there's a risk, and it could go either way, and with his age, the volatility in either direction is higher than usual. And so for folks that are risk averse, and if you're really high on the young core as is, I understand not wanting to do a Kevin Durant trade or it making you a little bit queasy. I get it. But the reason that I'm on board, if the price is right, the Rockets have a luxury of the young core being as deep as it is. 7 first-round picks from the last 4 draft cycles, 8 if you count this one. You can lose 1 or 2 of those guys, and if it's not Amen Thompson or Alperen Sengun, I don't think it dramatically changes your long-term outlook. The way I look at it, let's play the if something happened game. I was thinking about this earlier on my morning walk, and imagine if you read a report that in the off-season or in training camp that a player on the Rockets tears his Achilles or tears his ACL. Because in a contact sport at the highest level, this is a risk. This happens. Imagine if something happens and one of your young guys has a career-altering injury, not a career-threatening injury, because with medical science being what it is these days, generally players are able to come back. But let's say it costs them at least a season, and then there are questions as to if or when they get back to peak form, but more so, what does it mean on the financial side? Can you build a contender with a player on your books who's giving you either nothing or significantly less than they otherwise would because they've suffered an injury, because something happened? For me, the only 2 guys, if somebody just had a freak fall at training camp, and this happens in professional sports at the highest level, the only 2 guys that I would feel dramatically different about from a team perspective in terms of the outlook for the Rockets would be Amen or Sengun. I think other guys, certainly you'd feel terrible for them individually. It would be awful. God forbid this happens to anybody. You want everybody to be healthy. But let's use Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. as examples, because they're the 2 that have been cited as possibilities in these Kevin Durant talks. Now, I want to be clear. I have not heard either specifically from the Rockets. I mentioned them simply because they could make sense from a salary standpoint. The Rockets are actually very careful not to when they talk to reporters, give names, and I understand why. The last thing they want is these young guys to see their name in trade rumors and worry and have this baggage, this cloud hanging over them. No, they want them to just be able to work on their games and improve. And there's this clip that went viral this morning of Jabari Smith going through his offseason workouts. They don't want this cloud to be hanging over these guys. So, no, the Rockets have not specifically mentioned any of these guys, not to me. And I don't think we've seen names in the reporting that's out there from Kelly or Shams or anyone else. And that's by design. I'm just mentioning these because they fit from a salary perspective. And reading the tea leaves, you do have to give something to reach that $40+ million salary tier that you have to send out for a Kevin Durant deal to work financially. So if something happened to Jalen Green, it would certainly sting, but I don't think it would dramatically affect how I feel about the Rockets in the big picture. Like, the way I would respond to it is, wow, this really sucks, but let's see what Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore have got. You're going to slide them into expanded roles, and maybe one or both of them are able to take advantage. If something happens to Jabari Smith Jr., yeah, that sucks for him, and I like Jabari as a player and as a person, but let's expand Tari Eason's role to 30, 35 minutes per game, true starters minutes, now that he's 2 years removed from the stress reaction in his leg. Let's play Cam Whitmore some at the forward spots. He's certainly got the physicality and the power to do it, and there's a lot of upside there. If something were to happen to one player, it would sting, but the Rockets, they've got a luxury with the depth of this young core, and that's why I'm okay if it's just one of them, and maybe two if we're talking about, the 2025 pick at number 10 overall, or I guess Cam Whitmore, who is in the young core, but he's sort of on the fringe compared to the others. If it's just one of the true young core, then if it's not a Min or Şengün, I think the Rockets have enough depth that they could survive it. And that's why I'm willing to take the upside swing with KD and bet on that boom scenario, because even if it went bust, I don't think it would be catastrophic losing that one young player that you send out as the asset. Because, again, there's risk no matter what. And if you had to take Jalen Green off of this team because, God forbid, something happened to him, or Jabari Smith Jr., there are other options that you could turn to fill those minutes. And I wouldn't feel all that differently. I mean, there would be questions for sure, but I would at least see a path for the Rockets to remain in the same tier and have a comparable level of success as a team to what they would have had if the injury had never happened. So that's how I sort of define the if something happens game. That's what I call it. And so if you're talking about one player from your young core that isn't Şengün or Amin, it's annoying, but I don't think it's necessarily crippling. And so that's why I'd be okay taking the risk of the bust scenario of KD when you consider the upside of the boom scenario where everything hits and he lifts you into true title contention. Now, if we're talking two or three guys from that young core, and especially if it's the inner young core, then yeah, it's different, because if we're talking about multiple hypotheticals and having to count on two or three unproven guys all hitting and not having the optionality, I mentioned like Cam Whitmore is potentially an insurance policy at multiple spots. He could be an insurance policy for Jalen Green at shooting guard. He could also be an insurance policy at small forward for someone. If you're adding to the list of variables and you're also inherently reducing the insurance policies, because if you use insurance policy at one spot, then you won't have it available for another, then all of a sudden at that point, the downside risk becomes too much. And so that's why I wouldn't do, at least I don't think I would, Jalen and Jabari both, unless it's some sort of larger deal in which maybe you're also bringing in some other rotation caliber player at a bare minimum, ideally one with upside, along with Kevin Durant, and then you're sort of resetting the depth stockpile. But if it's just one player, I think I would take the risk. And I understand why the Rockets would, especially if it's one player that's not Şengün or Amin, and so one where there is upside, but it's probably limited upside, at least based on what we've seen to this point. So for me, my interest is conditional, but if the price is low enough, that's why I do it. And then, if Dylan Brooks goes in the deal, look, I love Dylan Brooks. He's a good veteran role player, but at 29 years old, the upside is limited. And I also think that we've seen from this front office led by Rafael Stone, they are good at identifying role players and making moves on the margins. Just look at how creative they got to pick up Steven Adams at the 2023 to 24 trade deadline and how that paid dividends months later. I trust the Rockets to be able to figure out, how to cost efficiently or asset efficiently fill out the back of their roster and find capable rotation players or rotation options for relatively cheap prices, be it in salaries, asset cost, or both. The harder part is the star level upside. That's what the Rockets are still trying to fill, be it internally or externally, that engine, that A1. And so if you're not crippling your depth, and if the cost is rotation players that are good but limited, like a Dylan Brooks, then yeah, I would err on the side of bringing in Kevin Durant. And there are risks with it, for sure. But I'm okay taking the risk when the upside is, hey, this guy could legitimately make you a title contender as soon as next season. And how fun would it be? Guys, this is the 30-year anniversary of when the Rockets last won an NBA championship. It's been 30 years. I'm still 40 years old. So that's 3/4 of my life since the Rockets have won an NBA championship. It's been a long time. So to be able to contend for a championship potentially as soon as next year and to have a top 15 all-time player leading your roster, one with ties to the state of Texas, guys, that would be so freaking fun. And I can tell you, having been through the last 30 years, these opportunities do not always come very easily. So that's why if the cost is low enough, yeah, I understand the risk, but the upside to me is worth it. And one other hypothetical that I've seen tossed out that I want to address before we close out the pod. Bill Simmons mentioned on that Zach Lowe podcast that I cited earlier, does it make sense for the Rockets to bid on Kevin Durant if there's the possibility that someone like Giannis is available a few months later? We've talked about him as an option in the past, and while he hasn't asked for a trade just yet, it might happen later this offseason. It might happen during next season. If the price is low enough, I don't think a Kevin Durant trade takes you out of the market for Giannis at all. The centerpieces of a deal for Giannis with the Bucks, a 30-year-old MVP, are very different than an MVP level player, one that's 1-2 in recent history and is all NBA every year. The centerpieces of a Giannis deal would be Alperen Şengün, because you need a proven young player with star level upside, and draft equity, unprotected equity from 2027 onward. Those really good premium assets from teams like the Suns, the Nets, the Mavericks that have either uncertain or bad outlooks as things stand right now for those years. That's still going to be there, in my opinion, if you do something like, Dylan, Jabari, Jock Landale, Aaron Holiday, and the 2025 pick for Kevin Durant, or Jalen Green in place of Dylan Brooks and Jabari Smith Jr. Now, if you're significantly cutting into that premium asset stockpile, then yeah, I'd probably walk away. But if the price for KD is moderate, I would call it an annoyance. Like, in a perfect world, would you have as many young assets as possible? Like, yeah, I'm sure the Bucks would probably have some baseline level of interest in Jabari Smith and, I don't know, whoever the number 10 pick in this year's draft turns into. For purposes of this conversation, I'm going to say Cedric Coward just because, well, I am intrigued in him as a prospect, but if you follow me on social media, I'm using the hashtag #ShootItCoward for a reason. It would be absolutely funny and hilarious for our social media culture. Also, I think the Coward jersey sales would be through the roof. How awesome would it be to have a Rocket shirt where obviously it says Rockets on the front and then Coward on the back? So mostly for the LOLs, but also, I am intrigued by his game. Let's use Cedric Coward as an example of who the pick eventually turns into. Do you really think the Bucks are going to say, well, we really like Alperen Şengün and these premium assets, but we're not interested because you don't have Jabari Smith and or Cedric Coward. I think that's a real stretch. I think not having assets of that tier, it's a nuisance. It's annoying. It would be easier if you had them. But if push comes to shove, you can get creative and recoup assets, at least something close to those values in other ways. Again, I trust Rafael Stone and Eli Whitus to do moves around the margins. It's the super high-end assets now and into the future. Those are the hard ones. And it's not because Rafael is bad at his job. They're just hard period in the NBA. There's not that many of them, and it's a league where high-end talent typically wins out. The same premium assets for Giannis would still be there even if you do this Kevin Durant deal. So no, I don't buy that the Rockets should wait and pass on a KD deal because what if Giannis comes available later? Well, for starters, it's hypothetical. We know Kevin Durant is actually available and he's still a top 15 all-star level player. But beyond that, the frameworks for the two deals are very different. And so if you can get Kevin Durant without dipping heavily into the assets that actually appeal to the Milwaukee Bucks in a scenario where Giannis is available, then I don't see why you wouldn't do the KD deal in the short term if it's available at the right price. Again, I'm talking about worlds where the downside scenarios are annoyances rather than crippling. Again, if KD goes bust and you no longer have Jalen Green or Jabari Smith Jr., it would certainly sting, but I don't think it dramatically changes the long-term outlook for this team. And if you don't have Jabari or Jalen or Cedric Coward or whoever it is, would those guys potentially help a Giannis trade? Yeah, but I don't think they're so valuable, especially on Jalen's contract, that they can't be replaced, that it would just kill a deal. And so for me, if the downside scenarios are more annoyance than crippling, then the upside is worth it. If you are bringing in an all-star level player that can get you at least on the fringe of championship contention as soon as next season, and we can go out there as a Rockets fan community and watch one of the greatest players in NBA history hoop for our team and be the A1 on a team that would probably enter as the number 2 squad in the Western Conference, because obviously they're coming off a second place finish, and now you potentially bring in Kevin Durant. For me, when the downside scenario is more annoying than crippling, then I'm good with that upside scenario. And that's why, if the cost is right, I think I want Kevin Durant. All right, one last little thing I want to throw out before we wind down the pod. And this is just a small rant on my part. So if you want to tune out now, feel free. This is not intel. This is just my soapbox. Stop listening and giving any credence to the betting odds. I saw a lot of talk last Friday that, Kevin Durant must be going to Minnesota because now the odds have swung wildly in favor of the Timberwolves and the Rockets are 4th. Guys, literally 24 hours ago, the Spurs were heavy favorites and now they're off the board. 9 times out of 10, betting odds are simply fans that are bored, that have too much money, reading the same reports and just making speculative guesses as to what they're actually going to mean. There are rare occasions, like before the 2022 draft, with the Paolo Banchero odds to go number 1 instead of Jabari with the Magic. There are extremely rare occasions where there actually is intel and a secret community that really knows. But 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. 9 times out of 10, it's just people reading the tea leaves, seeing the speculation from guys like Stephen A. Smith and what have you on the national shows, and just putting their money down, and many times it's ill-advised. And the lines, again, are about minimizing liability for Vegas. People always say Vegas knows. No, I mean, Vegas is responding for the most part. There are some situations, some exceptions, but generally Vegas is responding to the interests that they see from the marketplace. And they're going to move the line heavy in favor of Minnesota if all these bets on the Timberwolves are coming in, because if they keep Minnesota as the number 3 or number 4 team, and that eventually happens, and you have all these teams or all these people, betting on Minnesota at, plus 500 or whatever it is, then that's going to be a massive liability for them to pay out. Vegas is first and foremost about minimizing its potential liabilities. And so in these transaction betting windows, no, they usually don't have super secret intel, and most of the people betting don't. They're reading the same reports that we are, and Vegas is simply shifting the lines based on where the money is coming in. That's what's going on. And so if the betting line movement matches what you're seeing in the reporting, then sure, that's significant, but then you also see it in the reporting. To my knowledge, we have not seen that in the reporting. So if it's just the line moving, then it's typically, and we see this a lot, like it's wish casting. People want KD to go to a team with an established star, like the Spurs with Wemby or the Timberwolves with Anthony Edwards. It's just more fun to talk about. It fits into, and maybe this isn't even the model anymore with how the Pacers and Thunder are playing in the finals, but, this 2-3-star super team model, which has been all the buzz for the last 20, 30 years of NBA basketball, maybe longer. It's easier to put KD on the Timberwolves or the Spurs and type that lineup in on social media and get more clicks and get more engagement, as opposed to putting on a Houston team, which has a lot of nice pieces, but no established top-tier stars. It's just not as sexy. And so those other destinations get more talk. That ultimately leads to more interest in the betting markets. But no, you shouldn't panic unless it's also matched by the reporting, which it's not. Again, we just saw 2 days ago the Spurs being the heavy favorite, and now they're not even on the board. It's about the actual reporting, the actual information. Now, there are rare exceptions like the Paolo Banchero Magic pre-draft thing from a couple of years ago, but those are rare exceptions. And also, the movement there was way more significant than what we've seen here. So just besides it being a rare exception, the extent of the movement also suggested that there actually was something very unusual there. Just moderate moves, somebody going from, plus 400 to minus 110. I mean, it's a little bit of a move, but it's nowhere near, the Paolo thing where he went from like, I want to say plus 1600 to minus 1600. Like the moves were just crazy, just unprecedented. But more importantly, it's just, that's a 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 100 scenario. The vast majority of the time, the betting odds are a lagging indicator. They are people responding to the same reports, the same tidbits that you and I are reading on our social media feeds. So please do not get too high or too low based on the betting odds. Those are lagging indicators. Read the reports from certainly Shams at ESPN, but local reporters in Phoenix, other markets, people in Houston. Kelly Iko at The Athletic does a great job, and he first broke this, as I see it, 11 days ago, the fact that there's a clear pathway for the Rockets and Durant to actually work out. Follow the reports. Do not follow the betting lines. That would be my advice. And with that, I'll bring my soapbox and this episode to a close. All right, that'll do it for this Saturday the 14th. If you want more content before our next episode, which will probably be reacting to the Kevin Durant trade, whether it's with the Rockets or another team, best place to hear from me is on social media. I'm on Blue Sky at Ben Dubose. And this show, The Logger Line and The Rockets Wire, the USA Today blog where I'm the editor, those are on Twitter/X at those handles, The Logger Line, The Rockets Wire. And also if you go to The Logger Line, the podcast page on Twitter/X, hit the link tree in the bio, and you can find links to your distribution partners, Apple, Google, and Spotify. Subscribe, leave a positive review if you've not already. That's how we can keep looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors and keep this podcast running, one of the most active ones covering Houston Rockets basketball. You can also find links to friends of the program, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Karbach Brewing. Hit up those links, consume their content. Again, that's another way we can look good to all the relevant entities and keep this podcast running as one of the most active ones covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with the plugs complete, I will finally adjourn on this Saturday, June 14th. Again, I'm Ben Dubose. Appreciate you all so much for tuning in, and please come back soon for more new episodes of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.